my wife's a tough cookie. She's not a crybaby like I am. She absolutely shed a tear. And she said, I see now why you love going to Masonic Village so much. And it's absolutely true. I love coming here. I love talking about history. I love how engaged you are, how caring you are. And it really touched my heart to get these wonderful cards. Now, some of those cards are pretty wacky. And that made it even more fun. And the reason why you sent cards is somehow you learned that I had hurt my arm, and I did. What I ended up, and I just got a cast off my arm the other day. I ruptured my bicep tendon, my distal bicep tendon, which connects your bicep to your bone, your radius bone right here. I was working outside in the backyard, trying to lift a heavy extension ladder that was horizontally on hooks, and I gave it a shove and heard a loud pop. And it hurt a little bit, but not a lot. But the pop was really disturbing. Like, you could have heard that across the street. And I went in, kind of holding my arm, and I looked down at my arm, and you could see the bicep had kind of rolled up the arm. And I went in, and I said to my wife, I think I really hurt my arm. And she very helpfully said, I told you shouldn't overdo it. My issue was that I was leaving on a trip with 15 veterans to Croatia. Yeah, and the fact that I went to Croatia and Mim Bizik is still here is just such I'm so grateful to Mim. I thought Mim is Serbian, and I thought she might never talk to me again. But we did a trip to Croatia. It was really interesting to meet with Croatian veterans, have our veterans meet with Croatian veterans, part of NATO. It was a week-long NATO thing in Croatia. But I was taking these veterans there, and so I went to the doctor and said, can I go to Croatia? And he said, yeah, you could go, but you're really going to be cutting it close because the longer you take to get the surgery to reattach, the more the bicep retracts up the arm, and the harder it is to do the surgery. So you have to come the day after you get back. You've got to have the surgery. So that's what I did. And the whole time I'm in Croatia, I was trying to smooth my bicep back down my arm, hoping that it would work. So I'm so grateful for, and the surgery went fine, and I'm fine. I just can't lift heavy stuff, and I can't extend my arm all the way. But it's a miracle of modern medicine, as you know. Do you know what? You'll learn this someday. As you get older, you start to fall apart. That's the lesson. So listen, you showed such goodwill and kindness. I feel really, really bad talking about the subject tonight, because this subject, you blew it. You should do something else tonight, because if you want to hear a talk in the Electoral College, God help you. This is a boring subject, and it's convoluted, and it's complicated, and it's very hard to understand. Very few Americans understand it. So tonight's talk is kind of like, it's like the spinach of history lectures. You're not going to enjoy it, but it's good for you, for sure. The Electoral College. We have a presidential election coming up, which you may have heard about. And it's stunning how every 4 years we really do have to remind ourselves of the fact of the Electoral College. This unique American institution, one of a kind, so convoluted, so oddball, that what it means is essentially this: that the United States does not hold a national election where the people vote for president.
That's right.
We don't have that. We have something like that, but we don't have that. We don't have one national election. We have 50 state elections, plus the District of Columbia. And when we vote, we don't vote for president. We vote for people called electors who have said that they will vote for the candidate that you're choosing in the Electoral College after the national election or after Election Day on November 5th. That's how convoluted it is. And the presidential candidates are absolutely not trying to get the most votes. They're looking to get a majority of the Electoral College votes. They do not care if they get the most votes nationwide. So those national public opinion polls, you know, Harris and Trump are 4 points apart or 3 points apart, they really mean so little. It's all about the Electoral College. It's all about the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is made up of 538 electoral votes. These 538 are distributed unevenly through the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And according to the Constitution, you need over 1/2 of those electors to become president. That means 270. 50% of the Electoral College plus 1. You need 270 Electoral College votes. Each of these states has a different number of electors assigned to it. And those electors are assigned according to how many congressmen they have, plus how many US senators they have. And every state has 2 US senators. But each state has a different number of congressmen and congresswomen, congressional districts representing the state. So in New York, there are 29 congressional districts, with 29 congressmen and congresswomen having districts in New York. So, I'm sorry, oh my gosh, see? I screwed it up already. New York has how many congressional districts? 27, absolutely, not 29, 27. And then plus 2 are the US senators. South Dakota has 1 congressional district, 1, plus 2 US senators, so they have 3 electoral votes, as opposed to New York's 29 electoral votes. You could see these, so these electoral votes are distributed roughly, indirectly, in proportion to population, but not quite so. In fact, these electors favor the low population states. So low population states have more electors than they normally would if it was strictly by population. And the large population states have fewer electors than they would if they had been proportional to population. These electors, this is from Article 2 of the Constitution. These states are assigned these electors, and the electors themselves, who are people, are chosen by any method that the state legislature of each state chooses. They do not have to assign their electors according to a popular vote. And for much of our history, they did not do it that way. It's just been the custom for the past 120, 150 years that state legislatures have decided to assign their electors to the Electoral College according to the winner of the popular vote in the state. So the popular vote in the state is just to see which slate of electors should go to the Electoral College. If these states were to be, if the electors were to be distributed proportional to population, the electoral map would look very different. So for example, this is one of the problems with the Electoral College. California would have 65 electors instead of 54. So California is underrepresented in the Electoral College. Oh, man, there we go. Texas should have 48 electors, but they only have 40. Texas is underrepresented in the Electoral College. North Dakota, meanwhile, oh no, that's not North Dakota, that's Montana. My brother lives in Montana, I just visited him. And he was so excited because for the first time ever in history, Montana gets 4 electors in the Electoral College. For all of history, they've only had 3 because they've had 1 congressman for the entire state and then 2 US senators. But it's grown enough because of migrants from California that now the state is split into 2 congressional districts. So they get 4 electoral votes, but according to population, they should really only have 2. Pennsylvania, underrepresented. We should have 22 electors if it were strictly proportional to our population. We have 19. I think in 2020, we had 20 electors, but we lost some population since then in the 2020 census, and so 1 elector was taken away, 1 congressional district was taken away. This has created problems in the past because of the Electoral College and its quirks and idiosyncrasies. It is prone to unexpected results, surprise results, confounding results that precipitate political crisis in our country, and it has in the past. And I'm going to talk tonight and then next month about what some of these crises have been and how they've been resolved. Tonight, I'm really going to focus on the creation of the Electoral College and how it operated in the first few elections. Next month, I'm going to bring it up to the present day and spin out some potential problems that we might see this year in the Electoral College. Another problem with the Electoral College, and these are only 2 of the many problems, is that they tend to exaggerate the political differences among the states and the regions of the US. In most states, not all, that's what makes it so complicated, in most states, it's a winner-take-all Electoral College vote. In other words, if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania over Kamala Harris by 1 vote, Donald Trump gets all 19 electors, winner take all. Now there are 2 states that don't do it that way, and many states in the past have not done it that way, but it's been customary for states to do it that way for the past 100 years or so. That means that states are end up being all blue or all red. I live in a red state, I live in a blue state, and then there are a handful, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what are called swing states that seem to change every 4 years, or are very close. Pennsylvania is one of those swing states. That's why we will get many visits from the presidential candidates this year. Idaho won't get any. California won't get any. Maryland won't get any, because those states are not competitive. They're either all blue or all red, and there's nothing either candidate could do to change that. So we tend to think of, say, California as a blue state, which it is, Florida as a red state. But in reality, America is really purple. California and Florida are purple. I mean, you have millions upon millions upon millions of people in California who will vote for Donald Trump. He won't win the state, but he will win 45% of the vote, And the same in Florida. You will have a lot of voters, voting for the Democratic ticket, which won't win the state, but almost half of the population. We're really a 50-50 country. We're really a purple country. So these are 2 of the problems that feed in historically to the crises that the Electoral College has precipitated. Although the Electoral College also was designed to solve problems, and I'll be talking about that. But keep in mind, these electors, these 538 electors that meet, are people. They're people. They're not just checks on a box. They're actual people who have to meet and cast votes. Rarely do you ever see photos of them. This is a photo of Pennsylvania's 20 electors that cast votes in the Electoral College in 2012. These are all Obama electors. The state legislature, the state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, has a law that the state legislature will allow the campaigns to select the electors that the state will send to the Electoral College in the event that their campaign wins the popular vote here in Pennsylvania on November 5th. Get it? So the Biden campaign, they get to choose their 19 or 20. The Trump campaign, they get to choose their 19 or 20. And these 19 or 20 electors tend to be large donors or office holders, state, local office holders, never federal office holders. That's banned by the Constitution, doesn't allow it. So if you look closely at this picture, you'll see some state and local office holders. It is Rich Fitzgerald, right there. I think that's Jay Costa. Josh Shapiro is in 2012. So these are people who held state and local offices who are kind of being rewarded by being chosen as electors in the Electoral College. And these people do meet. Physically, they get together in their state capitals after election day on November 5th. So on November 5th, here's how it works. We go to the polls and we vote. Again, we're not voting directly for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. We're voting for a slate of electors that those campaigns have chosen to represent them when the Electoral College meets a month later. So, Pennsylvania, we have our election. Each of us goes in and we vote for one slate or the other. One slate or the other will win. And that means that slate, let's say it's Harris, the Harris slate will then meet on the first Wednesday after the second Monday in December. They will meet in Harrisburg in the state capitol, and they'll have an actual meeting, and they will fill out actual ballots for the Electoral College. And it's kind of funny because hundreds of times in the past, these electors have gone to the Electoral College meetings and changed their minds. And that happens. And it's legal. It's certainly constitutional. Certainly constitutional. They change their minds. And also, they misspell names. Barack Obama, Martin Van Buren. There have been serious name misspellings that have caused the electoral votes to be thrown out by Congress. So it's a real ballot. The ballot is filled out on that first Wednesday following the second Monday in December. And then a priest comes in and blesses it, puts holy water on it. They're folded up neatly into a cool little box. The box is then taken by couriers, and it's taken by couriers to Congress in Washington, D.C. And in Congress, the president of the Senate, which is who? The vice president. So it's Kamala Harris. She will convene a joint session of Congress, Senate, and she, the vice president, the president of the Senate, will open the votes and count them in the presence of the Congress. Congress will then vote to approve the vote count, and that's the election. That happens January 6th. This is really when the president is finally elected, when the vote is counted and the vote is certified, January 6th. This is a really convoluted system. It's really strange. A lot of countries have copied many aspects of the American political system. Not one country has ever replicated the Electoral College. The Electoral College was not known as the Electoral College until decades and decades after it was created. Probably right before the Civil War, people started calling it the Electoral College because there really wasn't a word for the system. Where they got the term Electoral College, they got it from two places. One, I remember my Polish mother telling me about this. My Polish mother was very proud, for some reason, that Poland had kings, but they weren't dynastic.
That's right.
Right? There's a Polish person right there. They weren't dynastic. They were elected. They were elected in what was called like an electoral convention. And so the founders thought this was kind of like that. Also, there's the College of Cardinals that elects the Pope, another kind of monarch figure that gets elected. It's not dynastic. So electoral college, that was a term that was given to describe this institution, this one-of-a-kind institution that was created over several weeks in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. This was the Constitutional Convention, and the selection of the executive of this new country was the most vexing problem that the founders faced. It was more confounding than slavery. Absolutely it was. They did not know how to handle this. They had not had an executive under the Articles of Confederation for 11 years. So when they opened up discussion, they saved it for last because they knew it was going to be very contentious and very difficult. They knew that they wanted some kind of executive, but they had no idea what. It took 30 days, 60 votes for them finally to agree. The clock ran out. They had to end the convention. But they finally and reluctantly agreed to go with what we know of as the Electoral College. Nobody liked it. Nobody loved it. But a majority of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention agreed to go along with it until it could be amended in the future. Nobody knew what to do. The discussion started out, should we have an executive that's a body of 3 people? A council? Maybe one from different parts of the country? It was finally decided that it could be consolidated into one person, but how would that one person be selected and how long would they serve? The 3 main ideas that were presented at the Constitutional Convention were that the president, the executive, the president of the United States would be selected by Congress. And that was almost immediately rejected because the founders agreed that they wanted a separation of powers and they wanted balance of the branches of power. So having a president who's answerable to Congress would not work. They wanted the executive to be a balance to the will of Congress, not to be an arm of Congress's will. So they rejected that out of hand. The second option, and this was discussed a whole lot, was have the states choose the president. Each state legislature would cast a single vote for president of the United States. They quickly decided that one of 2 things would happen. Either if you have 13 states, you'll have 13 different candidates, 13 different presidents. And the whole thing will be kicked to Congress, and they don't want that. Or, maybe even worse yet, the states will get together and conspire to select who they wanted, and it'll divide the country into 2. You'd have 7 states selecting the president every 4 years or 6 years as they were considering. And so they rejected. They didn't want the states to be directly involved in selecting the president. A few people, George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, James Wilson, they had the most cockamamie idea of all. And they proposed it, and they were almost howled out of Congress Hall in Philadelphia, and that was have the people choose. That was ridiculous, as you know, because we've talked about that so often here, especially as we're talking about Andrew Jackson. Because in 1787, democracy was a dirty word. It was an obscenity. You don't, if you want a decent human society, you don't structure it as a democracy because people are stupid. They're irrational. They vote with their, with their passions. They don't vote with their reason. They can't be trusted. They don't have a lot of information. And every democracy in the history of the world has committed suicide in one form or another. They all descended to anarchy and mob rule. No, democracy, you don't, the executive is too important a position to leave it to the people. And there's no way in 1787 will the American people have enough information about who the qualified candidates are out there to make a decision. So no, the people can't do it. So they were really stuck. And the convention spent September debating this. And one guy, not the brightest light in the founding firmament by any stretch of the imagination, this guy, James Wilson, from Pennsylvania, he proposed what we know of as the Electoral College. He had thrown out the idea of having he had proposed the idea of having the people decide on the executive to vote for president. He was laughed, that was rejected. So he came up with this really crazy kind of compromise. This, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and a little bit of that kind of displeased everybody, but didn't displease everybody so much that they couldn't accept it. James Wilson, he was an attorney. He was born in Scotland, immigrated here. He was an attorney in Philadelphia and then Lancaster. He later became a Supreme Court justice, went bankrupt. I think he died in debtor's prison or close to it. But he goes down in history as being the father of the Electoral College. Nobody wants that honorific in history. And here's the compromise that he came up with. You'll start with the state legislatures. Each state legislature will appoint electors to the Electoral College using any method they wish. They could choose the electors out of the phone book, and you remember what a phone book is. They could, they could do it just randomly in the population. They could choose any method that they want. They do not have to hold elections for these electors. These electors are selected by the state legislatures. These electors are selected. The electors then get together every 4 years, and they use any criteria they wish to elect a president. The majority, the president must win a majority of these electors. And then the president of the Senate will count the votes that the electors have cast in the presence of Congress, and that will be the election. So each one of these steps has a lot of options, or open to a lot of options. You could, the state legislatures, if they wanted to, could hold a popular election, which is what we do today. The state of Pennsylvania has been gracious enough to allow us to vote for president. And the electors then that we send to Harrisburg then vote for president. But Pennsylvania is not required by the Constitution to do that at all. And this is a more recent development in our electoral history. The original idea was that every elector would cast one vote for president. This was the original idea that was discussed in the Constitutional Convention. And the problem that immediately emerged was, well, then every elector from Pennsylvania then is going to vote for Robert Morris. And every elector, from Massachusetts is going to vote for John Adams. And then you're going to have every elector from every state voting for that state's native son, the favorite son. So how do you prevent that from happening? How do you prevent, again, like the problem with having the state legislature choose the president directly, how do you prevent the electors from bunching up and just selecting 13 different favorite sons from their state? You do it by forcing the electors to vote twice. They have to vote for two people. One person can be their favorite son. The second person must be, and this is the way it still is, the second vote that an elector cast must be from a different state. Which is why, by the way, if Donald Trump had chosen Marco Rubio as his running mate, there would have been a problem. There would have been a court challenge. That is, if Donald Trump is a resident of Florida and Marco Rubio is a resident of Florida, you can't have residents of the same state on a ticket. It's unconstitutional. That was a problem, by the way, in 2000. Dick Cheney's residence was in Texas, and he did have to change it before the election to Wyoming. so that he and George W. Bush could be on the same ticket. So the solution was to add a second vote. But think this through. This is how really smart and analytic the Founding Fathers were. They thought this through, and they thought, well, what's going to happen is these electors will cast their vote for their favorite son, and then they'll throw away their second vote with a vote for Mickey Mouse, or Alfred E. Newman, or Gracie Allen, who did run for president in 1940, and she got votes. FDR was not happy. This guy, he runs for president every year, Vermin Supreme. He wears a boot on his head, and he wants to give every American a pony, I think. I think that's his campaign. But you know, so you'd throw away your second vote, and that would still mean that everybody's really voting for their favorite son, and they're throwing away the second vote. So here's how the founders solved that problem. We elect not one executive, but two. And we call the second one the vice president. And the vice president will be the person who gets the second amount of votes. That's why the office of vice president was created. It was to solve this problem of the native son, and throwing away the second vote. Because if your vote is going to count for a second executive, you're not going to vote for Mickey Mouse. You're going to choose a serious candidate. But it also means that it's pretty clear that this vice presidential office was kind of tacked on to our political system to solve a discrete problem, which is why it has a reputation of being, well, not very good. John Nance Gardner, who was vice president under FDR, said, the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. But he didn't say spit. And then Will Rogers said, the person with the best job in the country is the vice president. All he has to do is get up every morning and say, how is the president? So that's why the vice president exists. Now, what if, and this was a big concern of the founders, what if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College? What happens? Here is what Article 2 says. If there's a tie in the Electoral College, and there might be this year, that could happen. If there's a tie in the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose, and look how the Constitution spells choose, I love that, choose by ballot one of them for president. And if no person have a majority, in other words, if they're, if like the election of that we just discussed, the election of 1824, where Andrew Jackson got a plurality of the electoral votes, but he didn't get a majority, and the Electoral College was split among 5 people. If no person gets a majority in the Electoral College, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president. But here's the kicker. But, and we're going to talk more about this next time, in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. Pennsylvania, let's say there's a tie in the Electoral College, or RFK Jr. gets a big surge and he wins some electoral votes, and no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College. Then the election will be thrown into the House of Representatives, and the state of Pennsylvania will have 1 vote. 1 vote. And the 17 congressmen and women from Pennsylvania will have to decide who to vote for. Those 17 congressmen and women, 9 of them are Republicans, 8 of them are Democrats. They're not going to be able to agree. They will not be able to vote. They will not submit a vote. And it turns out that most states are like Pennsylvania and probably won't be able to submit a vote. In that case, there are just a handful of states that are either all Republican congressmen or all Democratic congressmen, and it'll go down to those states going up against each other. So this was a problem that the founders foresaw and were very concerned about it. We really lucked out by having George Washington be our first president. And the only reason why the founders agreed to hold an electoral college and to have an executive is that we had Washington. Everybody loved Washington. I think I've talked about Washington here. If Washington didn't exist, there would be a need to create him. This country needed a unifying figure, and he was it. He played that role. George Washington played a role that was called George Washington, and he did it superbly, but he sacrificed a normal life because of it. His job was to hold the country together as long as he could, and he agreed to stand for president, and that allowed this whole constitutional system to get off the ground, because every state legislature could agree that our president should be George Washington. Everybody agreed on that. And George Washington is still our only president to win a unanimous election in the Electoral College twice. First time in 1789, and then his re-election in 1793. He won unanimously twice. And you see, he has 69 electors, and all 69 cast their first votes for Washington. And then, of course, they have to cast a second vote, and it has to be for a candidate outside of Virginia, in this case, because Washington was from Virginia. So the second votes were split among 11 candidates. John Adams happened to come in second with 34 of those second votes. He won 34 out of the 69 second votes. So John Adams got to be vice president. He came in second. That's how it worked. If you come in first, you become president. If you come in second in the Electoral College, you get to be vice president. And this is how it worked. In the first election of Washington, and then in the second election of Washington. Things got bad in the third election. Washington refused to do it again. He refused a third term, which meant in 1796, the election was going to go among different candidates. And something by 1796 had happened that the founders had always feared would happen, and they thought would ruin the country if it did. And that was American political opinion broke down into factions, into political parties. And the country became partisan and divided by political parties. The political parties were the Jeffersonian Republicans on the one hand, and the Hamiltonian, or the John Adams, Federalists on the other. And they had diametrically opposed views of what our country should be and what its future should look like. Diametrically opposed. Alexander Hamilton was for a strong national government, a close relationship with Great Britain, and a manufacturing economy, and weak state sovereignty. Thomas Jefferson, who served as Secretary of State, while Hamilton served as Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington, believed just the opposite, that the country should be an agrarian economy with strong states' rights, a weak national government, and a close relationship with revolutionary France. Our country was divided almost literally 50-50, very balanced. The southern states tended to favor Jefferson. The northern states in New England tended to favor Adams. The swing states, there were two of them, or three of them, were Pennsylvania and New York. Those are the big swing states in this election. They were split about 50-50. In the election of 1796, Adams won. There were 139 electors. You needed 70 for a majority. Adams got 71. This was a squeaker. Jefferson came in second with 68. That meant that these two opponents, who really grew to hate each other, served together as president and vice president for 4 years. It was very destabilizing to our republic, very much. As Jefferson was vice president, he was undermining the president all the time. All the time. He was operating a sabotage campaign from within the Adams administration the entire time. And it drove Adams, as you can imagine, batty. So much so that Adams was able to get Congress to pass a Sedition Act, which made it illegal to criticize Adams, which Jefferson, of course, protested, and it was a very bitter time in our history, very bitter time. And a lot of the focus of the debate at the time was, should we go to war against revolutionary France or on revolutionary France, in revolutionary France's favor? And all this set up the rematch of 1800. This was the election that almost destroyed the Republic. I say that so often here. We go, I'm always talking about these crises that almost destroyed the Republic, these crises that almost split the country. And it's like the boy who cried wolf. You know what I mean? You keep on saying it. If I keep on saying it, someday it's going to happen. And it did happen. It was called the Civil War. But what's amazing is that it took as long as the Civil War to finally divide the country, because we came so close, so often, every step of the way up to the Civil War. And the election of 1800 literally was one of those steps. We survived it, but barely. It was close. The election has been called the Magnificent Catastrophe, and I think that's a good name for it. This is a good book. Edward Larson wrote a good book about the election of 1800. Very dramatic face-off. It was magnificent because the country survived it. It was a catastrophe because it showed what could happen if things go wrong. And things did go wrong. This was a brutally partisan and cruel election. The country was split 50-50. The two candidates did not like each other, and each side accused the other of being traitors to the country. Boy, that reminds me of something. Come to me. The Jeffersonians accused John Adams of trying to sell our country back to the British Empire. That he was secretly had a plan that was to turn our sovereignty back over to the British Empire. That he was really a royalist, he was really a monarchist, don't believe a word he says, there is a conspiracy to turn our country back. The Adams folks believed, quite literally, that Thomas Jefferson was in league with Satan to undermine the country. Jefferson was famously not a Christian, and they accused him of being an atheist, which Jefferson said he was not. And so, the grand question at the present momentous epoch, the only question to be asked by every American, lay his hand on his heart and say, shall I continue in allegiance with God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God? This was a really, really bitter time in our history, and the country was very evenly divided. Again, the South generally favoring a majority in favor of Jefferson, New England a majority favoring John Adams and the Federalists. The swing states, Pennsylvania and New York. Look at this, Pennsylvania, 15 electors. They had decided, Pennsylvania was in the habit in the 19th century of changing how they ascribed their electors every 4 years. They changed it. They changed the rules of the election. So in this year, they decided that they were going to split their electors. That Pennsylvania would have 15 electors, and they would assign those electors in proportion to the popular vote in the state. So it was a 50-50 vote. So one of them would get 8 electors, one of them would get 7 electors. So Pennsylvania kind of split. Being a swing state, decided to split its electors. The problem for Jefferson was New York State. New York State was also a 50-50 state. But it had a big barrier to be allowed to vote. You had to own property to be able to vote in New York State. And they had a state assembly that turned over every year. Every year. Their state assemblymen, their state representatives, served 1-year terms, and they stood for re-election every year. And in 1799, in April of 1799, there was a big election for the New York State Assembly, and the Federalists, the Hamiltonians, wiped the Jeffersonians out of the Assembly. It was an overwhelming Federalist majority. This was not good, because you'll remember the Electoral College, the electors are selected by the state legislatures. So the New York State Assembly, they weren't going to hold a popular election. The State Assembly was going to decide what electors they were going to send to the Electoral College. You had an assembly full of Federalists, all supporting Hamilton and John Adams. They were going to throw their electors to Adams. It looked like curtains for Thomas Jefferson. And then a man showed up in Thomas Jefferson's life and made him an offer that was difficult to refuse. And that man was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr came to Jefferson and said, I think I could turn New York for you. I think we could change. They have an election, New York has an election every year. All we need to do is flip the New York State Assembly from Federalists to Republicans, from supporters of John Adams to supporters of Thomas Jefferson. So he targeted the statewide election for state assembly in April of 1800. If we could flip the assembly in April, then we could have the people in place in the assembly to appoint the electors in December. Get it? So Burr was the first to do something that had never been done before, and that is actually campaign. Electioneering. He was an election engineer. Nobody had ever done this before. He went out and gave speeches. He ran for office himself. Aaron Burr had been a Revolutionary War general. He had been a senator, U.S. senator. He had been an attorney general for New York. He was an elite, he was far beyond what a state assemblyman would be, but he ran for state assembly, and he got celebrities to run for New York State Assembly. Horatio Gates, he was a famous Revolutionary War general. He had dementia. He was unfit for office, but everybody knew his name. Aaron Burr convinced him to put his name on the ballot. And Gates said, yeah, but I don't want to go to meetings. And Burr said, you don't have to, you just have to go to one and vote for the electors in the Electoral College. So he ran and he won. Burr took a social club and turned it in, that was called the Tammany Society, and he turned it into what we call a political machine or a political operation. He got voters registered to vote who had never voted before. Poor German immigrants, poor immigrants from the Caribbean, free blacks in Manhattan. And there were thousands and thousands of them. These people had never voted before. They weren't eligible to vote because they didn't own property. So Burr bought property. He was an attorney. He sliced up the property in such a way as to deed over property to each voter so that they would now be qualified to vote. He made sure that they got to the polls. He made sure that they cast their votes. And he did this with money that he raised through a bank that he created. The bank was called the Bank of Manhattan. He sought the charter. In New York, to operate a bank, you need to get a state charter from the state assembly. Aaron Burr knew that there's no way the Federalists in the New York State Assembly would ever give him a charter for a bank. So he didn't say I was opening a bank. He said, I'm opening a water company, the Manhattan Company. It's going to provide clean water for the good people of Manhattan. Buried in the fine print was the fact that this water company could make loans and it could take deposits. So he got the charter, he opened up the water company, he took 5% of the financing of the company, dug a few wells, and then spent 95% on this campaign, on paying voters and electioneering to get voters out to vote. This company, by the way, is JP Morgan Chase today. Chase Manhattan, it became Chase Manhattan. Hamilton also, Alexander Hamilton created a bank at the same time, the Bank of New York, to rival the Bank of Manhattan. And that bank today is BNY Mellon. So both those banks still exist, and both have a big role to play in our American society. So it's stunning that Burr was able to pull this off. He did get people to the polls. He was able it was the largest turnout by far in New York history. 20 times the number of people voted in New York in 1800 than in 1799. 20 times. And they overwhelmed the state assembly with Jeffersonian supporters. He had the supporters he needed in the New York State Assembly to get those 12 electoral votes. So remember how this works. 138 electors, here they are, in the election of 1800. Each elector casts 2 votes. Each will now vote for a ticket, because now you're just not selecting people that you admire. The country is now so partisan that if you're a supporter of Jefferson, you're going to cast your second vote for another Jeffersonian. Who was that Jeffersonian going to be? The deal Aaron Burr made with Thomas Jefferson is, I will win this election for you if you allow me to run as the vice president on your ticket. And so that was the arrangement. The arrangement was every elector who supported Jefferson would cast their first vote for Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, and their second vote for Aaron Burr from New Jersey or New York. And that's how it was going to work. The first place in the Electoral College would go to the president, second place to vice president. Now, if you're going to play this game, you have to make sure that your electors, that one of your electors, could be anywhere in the Electoral College, one of them votes for Jefferson first, and then not Aaron Burr second, right? Because otherwise you tie, and that's no good. The Federalists knew how to play this game. They did it well. John Adams, his electors, there were 65 Federalist electors in the Electoral College in 1800. John Adams got 65 first votes, and Charles C. Pinckney from South Carolina got 64 second votes. One of the electors threw away his vote for John Jay. He needed to do that because he wanted these electors wanted Adams to come in first with president and Pinckney to come in second as vice president. You would think that the Jeffersonians would have this figured out, but look what happened in the Electoral College. Jefferson and Burr tied, 73 to 73. Somebody forgot to leave Aaron Burr off their second vote. And historians today don't know why. We don't, this is just how it is with Aaron Burr. The guy's a total mystery. He burned all his papers, all his correspondence. We don't know exactly how this came down, but in subsequent decades, people would tell stories and remember, yeah, Aaron Burr was working it behind the scenes, saying, no, vote for me with your second vote. I'm having Charlie from another state not vote for me. And then he would tell the same thing to the other person. In other words, he was working the system. He was setting this tie up. And this tie meant that the presidential, no candidate got a majority in the Electoral College. It was a tie, which meant that the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives had to decide who was president based on one vote per state. In February 1801, they started voting. And here's what they did. They had 35 straight votes, and it came out the same way each time. Jefferson won 8 states, Burr won 6, and 2 states failed to vote. Maryland and Vermont failed to vote. This was not good enough because you need a majority of states, and there were 16 states. You needed 9 states to win the presidency. The country was stuck. There was no way out, and we couldn't figure out how to get around it. The Federalists were happy to keep it stuck, because if it was stuck, that meant that John Marshall, Federalist, Secretary of State, would become the acting president. And they were happy with John Marshall being president instead of Thomas Jefferson, who was in league with the devil. I mean, it is hard. It's the only institution worse than Jefferson in the eyes of most New Englanders was the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church was truly satanic, and Jefferson was just in league with Satan. So, I mean, it was that intense, that the hatred was that intense. So all the time that Congress and the House of Representatives is trying to resolve this issue, Aaron Burr is working behind the scenes to flip a couple more states in his favor. He starts to convince the Jeffersonians, flip your vote for me, and I will rule as Jeffersonian. And then he approached the Federalists, and he told them, flip your vote to me, and I'll rule as a Federalist, and I'll appoint you. He offered Charles Pinckney, who was vice presidential candidate, a major role in his cabinet if some Federalist states would flip their vote for him. It really looked like Burr was going to succeed, and he was going to be able to kind of work the House of Representatives to vote him, elect him president. And when word got out that Aaron Burr was trying to manipulate the House of Representatives and that he was going to govern as a Federalist, the whole country literally went up in arms. Thomas McCain, actually it started with Monroe. Yes, Monroe started it. James Monroe, governor of Virginia, said, he was a staunch Jeffersonian. He said, if Aaron Burr steals this election from Jefferson, I will call up the state militia and march on Washington, D.C. and prevent Burr from taking office. The governor of Massachusetts, I forget his name, responded and said, well, I'll call up our militia if Jefferson becomes president, and I'll march on Washington, D.C. And McCain, who was a Jeffersonian, said, oh yeah, well that means you have to cross into Pennsylvania and we're going to block the roads. It was really intense. I mean, it got to the point where it did look like the nation was going to be up in arms. And the savior of the nation at this point, and it's not an exaggeration to say this, the man who saved the country at this point was Jefferson's worst enemy, and that was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had the character to go to his fellow Federalists in the House of Representatives and say, don't do this. Don't do this. Let Jefferson get the White House. Now, he was also shrewdly saying, if you allow Jefferson to take the White House, you will convince the Jeffersonians that the U.S. Constitution, which Jeffersonians didn't like, is legitimate. We'll get a buy-in. They'll buy into this system. So allow Jefferson to take the office. Don't give in to Burr. And he wrote, Jefferson, though too revolutionary in his notions, is yet a lover of liberty and will be desirous of something like orderly government. Burr loves nothing but himself, thinks of nothing but his own aggrandizement, and will be content with nothing short of permanent power in his own hands. In a choice of evils, let them take the least. Jefferson is in every view less dangerous than Burr. He was able to convince a series of states to flip their votes in favor of Federalists, in favor of Jefferson, which pushed Jefferson over the edge. He won 10 states in the final vote, and Thomas Jefferson became president. And it was really because of Alexander Hamilton. This near disaster led to the 12th Amendment, which we have today, which was ratified in 1804. No longer do we have, you get the first, you come in first in the Electoral College, you get to be president. You come in second, you get to be vice president. Now these two electoral votes that every elector casts are dedicated. One is for president, and the second is for vice president. So there's no way we could have a tie like Jefferson and Burr, two people on the same ticket, tying in the Electoral College. We could still have a tie, but it wouldn't be that kind of a tie. I will be back here in 5 weeks, and if you think this was complicated, we're going to get into some really crazy elections, including the election of 1960, the election of 1876, all the times when the Electoral College really barely worked. We barely got through it. And I'm going to ask the question, how should we change this, if we should change it at all? But that'll be next time. Thank you.